Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about formal Japanese desu masu. Some people may be surprised that we've gone for 14 lessons without using this at all, when most courses use it from the very first lesson. Now there are good reasons why we haven't. One reason is that desu masu form is actually quite eccentric. It does various things that most of the rest of Japanese doesn't do. So if we learn this as the standard way to speak, we get all sorts of strange ideas about the way Japanese works. We could have started learning it a little earlier, but frankly, I think that there are more important priorities, and that it's a good idea to get real standard Japanese firmly fixed in our minds before we enter the rather troubled area of desu masu. It isn't difficult once you have very firmly established standard Japanese structures in your mind, and we've done that now. If you haven't done it yet, if you haven't followed this course, please go back to the first lesson right now. Off you go. Right, now for the rest of you, let's start with masu. Masu is a verb. It's not part of a verb, it's a verb in itself. It's a helper verb, like lots of other helper verbs that we've looked at up to this point. It attaches to our old friend the E stem, and it doesn't change the meaning of the word it attaches to in any way. It simply makes it formal. So, aruku becomes arukimasu, hanasu becomes hanashimasu, and so forth. And they are simply the formal way of saying speak, walk, etc. Now, another reason I didn't teach this earlier is because people say that there are only two irregular verbs in Japanese. I've said this myself, but the truth is that there is another one, and it's masu. And masu isn't irregular in the way that kuru and suru are irregular. It's much worse. It does something that is done nowhere else in modern Japanese. Now the good news is that the past tense is completely regular and normal. It works the same way as any other su-ending verb. It's mashita. But the negative is not masanai, it's masen. And what kind of a word is masen? It's really nothing that exists in modern Japanese at all. The textbooks tell us that it's the negative form of the verb, but then they tell us that the verb is whatever masu is attached to. And they also tell us that nai is the negative form of a verb when it's nothing of the sort. It's a helper adjective. We don't need to go into what masen actually is structurally, because it doesn't happen anywhere else in modern Japanese, so we just learn it as a fact. The negative of masu is masen. And that's another reason I didn't teach it earlier, because there isn't much of this in Japanese, things that you just have to learn as a fact. If you know the principles behind things, generally speaking, you can understand how everything works without a lot of memorization. So when you start off learning that you just have to learn that the negative of masu verbs, as they're called, in other words the masu helper verb, is masen, you start off with the idea that Japanese just does various random things like a European language. Now, the negative past gets even stranger. There isn't any past of sen, the way nai becomes nakata. So what do? We just throw the past tense of desu onto the end of masen and say masen deshita. Arukimasen deshita, I didn't walk. A lot of Japanese people who study Japanese grammar really dislike this, and I can't blame them. But it has, for better or worse, become standard Japanese grammar, so we just have to remember it. It's really only a couple of irregularities, and they're not really difficult to remember, just as long as we don't learn them at the beginning where they confuse our whole understanding of Japanese. If we learn masu as a so-called conjugation, and we believe that that is the base form of the verb, then to make other forms of verbs, we find ourselves taking off the masu and then changing the I stem for a different kind of stem in order to do something else, which would be complicated enough if we knew about stems, but the textbooks don't tell us that either, so we've just got a lot of completely random European-style rules and regulations that make no sense at all. So let's move on to desu. Desu, as you know, is the formal version of da. It's the copula. It works exactly like da. So if you know da, you know desu already. Except that this also has a strange quirk, which is that if we take an adjective like akai, meaning is red, we put desu onto the end of it in formal speech. It doesn't do anything. It just decorates the sentence and makes it formal. Again, this is something you just have to learn, and it's not very difficult to learn. But if you learn it at the beginning, you get the impression that you need the copula with an adjective like akai, just as you need the copula with an adjectival noun like kirei. And of course, the fact that they call adjectival nouns na adjectives just makes it even more confusing. You think that adjectives take the copula, and they don't. Real adjectives, the adjectives, do not take the copula, except that in the rather strange desu masu form, we pop desu on the end just for decoration. Adjectival nouns, on the other hand, of course, do take the copula because they're nouns. And all nouns take the copula. So we say, akai is red, kireida is pretty. Akai desu is red with a decoration. Kirei desu is pretty with the proper copula that it needs in the formal form. So as you see, formal Japanese is not really all that difficult. We have to learn a few rather strange facts, and it's not like most of the rest of Japanese, which is terribly Lego-like and logical. It's got little quirky bits and pieces to it, but not many, and so long as you've got real Japanese fixed firmly in your mind, adding on desu masu form is not particularly difficult. A couple of other things worth knowing. One of the things is that as well as saying masen, we can also say nai des. So we can say Sakura ga hanashimasen, Sakura doesn't talk, or we can say Sakura ga hanasanai desu. And that, of course, is perfectly logical and sensible, if any of it is, because since we put des onto the end of adjectives in formal speech, we can also put it onto the end of the nai helper adjective, which is really just another adjective. We don't make many changes to masu because it really is a sentence ender. We put it right at the end of whatever else we're doing in order to add formality to the sentence. However, we can use both desu and masu with the volitional helper verb. And once again, masu behaves eccentrically because its o stem is not, as you would expect, maso, but masho. So the volitional form is masho. Fortunately, this is only slightly eccentric and not difficult to manage. And also fortunately, desu forms a matching pair with masu in the volitional form and becomes desho. And since we're raising the subject of the volitional, let's cover that too. Its formation is very simple, and it's one of the few things that we do with the o stem of verbs. The Godan volitional helper, like the potential helper is just a single kana ru, and the volitional helper is just a single kana u. And we put it onto the end of the o stem, and it lengthens the o sound. So hanasu becomes hanaso, aruku becomes aruko, and so forth. What does it mean? Well, the name really tells you what it means. Volition means will. So the volitional expresses or invokes the will. The most usual use of it is setting the will of a group of people in a particular direction. So we say, ikimashou, let's go. And some people call the tai helper adjective volitional as well, which is confusing because they aren't the same thing. And the thing here to remember is that tai expresses desire, wanting to do something. The volitional form expresses will, and will and desire aren't the same thing. For example, you may have a will to do your homework. It doesn't mean that you want to do your homework. What you actually want is to play Captain Toad, but you set your will to doing your homework. And when we say things like, "Iko, let's go," for things that we might all want to do. Let's all have a picnic, let's have a party, but also, let's tidy the room, let's do our homework. It's expressing will, not want. You'll very often see on Japanese signs things like, "Gomi o mochi kairimashou," let's pick up our trash and take it home, which always seems to me like quite a nice kind of exhortation, rather different from the Western signs that say, "Pick up your rubbish or we'll confiscate your car and dye your children purple." Now, there are a number of uses of the volitional along with particles like ka and to, but we're not going to go into them here because I don't think that learning lists of usages is a good way to learn. We'll tackle these as we come to them, perhaps in the course of Alice's adventures. But one use of this form that is worth knowing, because you'll see it pretty often, is that we use the volitional form of the copula, da or des. Da, which isn't really a verb in the usual sense, the volitional is daro. And if we add that to any other sentence, it gives the meaning of probably. Sarewa akai dashou, that's probably red, I think it's red. Sakura ga kuru deshou, I think Sakura's coming, Sakura's probably coming. So now we know how to use the volitional and how to use formal Japanese. So, ikimashou, let's go. If you have any questions or comments, please ask them in the comments below, and I will answer. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.